Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to recommend a bunch of queer books. More specifically, I'm going to be recommending books for the Queer Lit Readathon Round 14 bingo board prompts. If you're watching this video as it comes out, the 14th round of the Queer Lit Readathon is about to kick off this coming Sunday, December 15th. As always, the incredible creators Kathy and Rogan, along with their co-host, have put together a wonderful bingo board full of reading prompts. But even if you're watching this after the readathon is passed, or if you're not taking part this round, you're still going to get an evergreen list of great queer books that you can check out any time of year. Shout out to my friend Alex of Pucks and Paperbacks, who also did a similar video recently recommending books for every single prompt on the bingo board. He had some really great selections, and they're different from mine, so if you want even more options for the round 14 bingo board, I will link that for you down below. I'm going to be sharing at least 2 recs per prompt, and I will try to note where you can double up on prompts as well. So let's get right into it, starting with the disability rep prompt. The first book I recommend for this is Lake Lore by A.M. McLemore. This is a queer YA magical realism story following 2 disabled non-binary Latina characters, Lore and Bastian, who live in a small lakeside town, and they're the only ones who know about a magical and mysterious world that dwells beneath the surface of the lake. When the lake begins rising and the world beneath the lake begins drifting into the real world, it threatens to drag out Lore and Bastian's secrets along with it. Both characters in this story, like I said, are disabled. Bastian is ADHD and Lore is dyslexic, which very much plays into how they interact with this magical lake. It's just a really beautiful story exploring both the complexity of imagining new ways of living and existing, and also the simultaneous exhaustion of contending with a world that doesn't make space for you to exist in the first place. I also highly recommend the audiobook if you can access it, because it's read by the incomparable Vico Ortiz, and this book could also count for the magic prompt. My other recommendation is the Luis Ortega Survival Club by Sonora Reyes. This is a John Tucker Must Die type story about a queer autistic high schooler named Ariana, who is largely nonverbal and doesn't have many friends. So when a cute popular guy named Luis begins paying attention to her, it makes her feel good about herself. But things between them quickly escalate, and Luis pressures her to have sex at a party, sex that she doesn't actually consent to. And while the rumor mill at school is already condemning her, she finds a mysterious note in her locker that leads her to a group of students who are determined to expose Luis for the predator he truly is. While this story definitely comes with strong content warnings for sexual assault and experienced ableism, it's also an empowering story about reclaiming your agency and finding power and comfort in community, even and especially in the darkest of times. And because the story strongly involves this tight-knit queer friend group, I would also say this book could easily count for the community prompt as well. Another book I'll briefly mention is Time and Time Again by Chatham Greenfield. I haven't read this one myself, but I know it's a YA sapphic time loop romance, and one of the main characters has IBS and chronic pain. It could also count for the travel prompt because it's kind of time travel-y, as well as the past, present, future prompt for the same reasons. Speaking of which, travel is the next prompt. This is very open-ended. It could mean a story about time travel, a story about a magical quest, a road trip story, etc. My first recommendation is a recent read of mine, and that is The Flicker by H.E. Edgman. This is a queer indigenous middle grade post-apocalyptic story about 2 step-siblings, Millie and Rose, whose only remaining parental figure recently passed away, leaving them to raise their 9-month-old brother Sammy by themselves. A solar flare has scorched and destroyed the surface of the earth, and their supplies are running dangerously low, so they have to decide between finding a new place to live and risking their lives on the surface, or staying and most likely dying of starvation. They set out to find Millie's grandmother, who is a resourceful Seminole elder, and on their way they run into another group of survivors who offer to help them along their journey, but who they don't know whether they should trust. This is sort of a classic adventure/quest story following these young characters as they traverse an increasingly dangerous landscape and literally try to travel across state lines on foot. But it's also a great story about the importance of building community and building trust, especially in a world that tries to forcibly divest us of those things. On a very different note, I would also recommend You Should Be So Lucky by Cat Sebastian for this prompt. Give me a second, okay? It'll make sense. This is a historical mid-century romance about a widowed journalist named Mark who is reassigned from book reviews to covering sports. More specifically, his assignment is to tail the Robins' new shortstop, Eddie O'Leary, who happens to be going through the worst hitting slump of his life. On the surface, they have absolutely nothing in common, but the more time they spend together, the closer they become, and Mark realizes that this is not merely a story about baseball, but rather the resilience of the human spirit. Cat Sebastian is simply second to none. She is always able to combine humor and heart in delightfully unexpected ways. This is definitely a story about 2 idiots bumbling their way towards each other, but more importantly, it's a tender exploration of grief in all its different forms, and also a celebration of this really beautiful romance. I do think this fits the travel prompt because obviously baseball teams travel across the country during the season and Mark has to tag along with Eddie and the team. So yes, they are primarily in New York, but they also travel to a lot of other places. And I think this could comfortably fit into the disaster queers prompt as well. Then we have the gender bent retelling prompt. My first suggestion is Most Ardently by Gabe Colnavoa. This is a trans mask and gender bent remix of Pride and Prejudice. It's about a young trans man named Oliver Bennett who's forced to attend balls, wear pretty dresses, and entertain suitors who want to make him their wife. The only solace he finds is when he can sneak out of his family's home dressed as the young gentleman he truly is. And on one such occasion, he runs into Darcy, a sulky young man who was rude to him when Oliver was presented as Elizabeth at a recent social function. But outside of the public eye, Oliver is realizing that Darcy is actually intelligent, warm-hearted, and secretly very sweet. I haven't read this one yet myself, but I've been trying to make it happen all year long. I've heard really great things about this as a retelling, and I think it more than fits the prompt. I would also recommend The Palace of Eros by Quero de Robertes. This is a gender-bent retelling of the myth of Psyche and Eros. It's about a mortal woman named Psyche who is said to be so beautiful that she outshines the goddess Aphrodite herself. Aphrodite obviously does not care for these claims, and she decides to torment Psyche's family and destroy their livelihood as punishment, to the point where Psyche's father seeks the oracle's advice. The oracle advises him to tie Psyche to a rock at the top of a cliff and leave her there to die, which he does. But instead of being torn limb from limb by a monster as was foretold, Psyche is rescued by Aphrodite's non-binary child, Eros, and whisked away to their mysterious palace far from the eyes of humans and gods. This is one of my favorite books I've read this year by far. The prose is beautiful and lyrical, and it's a very thoughtfully crafted narrative that explores the importance of agency and choice, especially when it comes to the ways we express ourselves. I also definitely recommend the audiobook for this one if you can access it because it's read by the author themselves. Very quickly, I want to give a nod to Emmett by Elsie Rosen, which is a modern gender-bent Emma retelling, and also The Story of the Hundred Promises by Neil Cochran, which is a T for T reimagining of a Beauty and the Beast type fairy tale, which could also count for the travel prompt. Next, we have The Free Space. Now, I can't give you book recs for this one, obviously, but Alex gave some prompt suggestions in his video, which I thought was a great idea, so I will also give you some myself. For example, I usually make this an arc-related prompt, so if you're someone who also reviews books and has some unread review copies you need to get to, or 2025 releases you want an excuse to pick up, that could be a great choice. You could read a queer horror book, you could read a book less than 200 pages, you could read a book about queer indigeneity, you could read a middle grade book, you could read a book written by a queer author that isn't necessarily about queer identity. The possibilities are endless, but those are just a few choices. After that, we have the drag prompt, and the first book I have to recommend is one that you thought I was done talking about, but I will never be done talking about it, and that is The House of Impossible Beauties by Joseph Cassara. This is a truly stupendous, fictionalized account of the origins of the House of Extravaganza set in 1980s New York. It follows Angel, who is new to the drag world and ball culture and just wants to create community and family for those who don't have it, like herself. She falls in love with a dancer named Hector, and together they form the House of Extravaganza, the first ever all-Latina house in the Harlem ball circuit. It's about Angel's rise to becoming mother of the house and the young drag performers and trans women who come through her doors, as well as the various difficulties and barriers they face. If you haven't heard me say it recently, this is a truly extraordinary book. I think about it literally all the time. It's an unflinching story that excavates and celebrates essential queer history and shows just how much culture and liberation that we owe to the drag community in the first place. If you haven't read it, you need to read it, and for obvious reasons, this would also fit into the community prompt. My second thought was a 2024 release called Don't Be a Drag by Skye Quinlan. This is a queer YA romance between two drag kings. It's about a teenager named Briar whose mental health takes a turn and her parents send her to spend the summer in New York with her older brother, who happens to be a very well-known drag performer. She tags along with him to his shows, where she winds up signing herself up for the annual Drag King competition, even though she's never done a drag performance in her life. This just sounds like a really fun story. It's incredibly rare to have stories about drag kings as well, which I think is really cool. And again, I think this could also very easily fit into the community prompt. The next category is food, and you're gonna think my first choice is counterintuitive, but just give me a second. give me a chance. The first book I would have to recommend is I'll Have What He's Having by Adib Khorram. This is an adult romance about an Iranian man named Farzan who feels very lost, feels like the disappointment of his family, and after his most recent breakup, he decides to go to this swanky new wine bar to drown his sorrows. There, he is waited on by a handsome sommelier named David who mistakes Farzan as a hugely influential food critic and wines and dines him for all he's worth. Eventually, they get to know each other and they strike a deal where David will help Farzan learn how to run his family's restaurant, and Farzan will help David study for his master som test. And if they happen to help each other out in different ways in the meantime, then so be it. I love this adult romance from Adib so much. It's fun, it's heartfelt, it's sexy, and it's also such a great celebration of good food and good wine and those moments of connection and community that often come when sharing both of those things. Trust me, even though this is a wine-forward book, food is definitely an integral part of the overall story and the romance. The other book that immediately came to mind for this prompt is Andar and Santi Were Here by Johnny Gazavia. This is one of my favorite books. It is a queer coming-of-age story about a non-binary Mexican-American artist named Ander whose family owns a taqueria where they've always worked, but they've taken a gap year before going to art school, during which their family fires them from the taqueria so they can focus full-time on their art. But the thing is, they still have to help hire and train their own replacement, which is where Santi comes in as the hot new waiter at the restaurant. You've heard me gush about this one a million times. It truly deserves all the love and all the accolades in the world, and because it's set primarily around this family taqueria, it definitely fulfills this prompt. Next up is the magic prompt, and the first book I want to recommend is Reverie by Ryan LaSala. This was Ryan's debut novel. I still think it is massively underrated. It's kind of like Inception plus queer magic. It's about a teenager named Kane who is found in a river half dead, but he can't remember what happened, how he got there, or why suddenly everything in his life just feels off. After three strangers claim to be his closest friends and the only ones who can fill in those missing gaps, he begins falling into these reveries without warning, which are basically like fantastical alternate realities. And there he discovers a sinister force threatening to unravel reality itself. I maintain that this is one of the most original and creative YA books I've ever read. It is the very embodiment of queer chaos in the best possible way, and it is mind-bendingly satisfying to work out the mystery of these magical reveries. One of the prominent supporting characters is also like a magical drag queen, so this could also potentially cover the drag prompt. The second book I'll mention for this prompt is one that I knew I wanted to recommend, but I wasn't sure where to fit it in, and because of the genre, I think this prompt makes the most sense. That is Asunder by Kirsten Hall. The main character in this book, Karis, is wildly bisexual, so this is in fact a queer high fantasy story following Karis, a death speaker who has sold her soul to a horrifying eldritch monster in exchange for her magic. She has the ability to communicate with the recently deceased, so she mostly goes around investigating suspicious deaths around the city. But one of these investigations leads her to discover a horrifying new species as well as a deeply tangled political conspiracy, and she ends up accidentally binding herself to a dying stranger who might just be her only chance at uncovering the truth. If you're someone looking for an exciting blend of horror, fantasy, adventure, and yearning, then I am on my hands and knees begging you to please read this book. The next prompt is the community prompt. First, I would recommend Between Perfect and Real by Ray Stovey. It's about a trans guy named Dean who absolutely knows that he is trans, but everyone, including his girlfriend and high school theater director, sees him as a lesbian. And in fact, he was recently cast as Romeo in his school's gender-bent production of Romeo and Juliet. At first, he tells himself that he'll just wait until he's in college to come out, but now that he's playing Romeo every single day in rehearsals and feels what it's like to present and be seen as a guy, he knows that he doesn't want that reality to exist solely on the stage. I put this book under this prompt for a very specific reason, because as Dean is struggling with this dissonance of knowing himself but not being seen as himself, he begins attending these local support groups. And it's through these support groups that he connects with queer and trans folks of all ages and backgrounds who can give him perspective and validate him in ways that he's otherwise missing in his life. While that's not the entirety of the story, it is an invaluable part of the story and one that I hope trans youth reading this book can take away from it the most. My other recommendation for this prompt is Libertad by Bessie Flores Zaldivar. This is a YA contemporary story set entirely in Honduras during 2017 amidst a very controversial presidential election. The story follows a queer teenager named Libertad who finds solace in writing radical political poetry on her secret Instagram account. One day, her mom finds text messages on her phone mentioning a kiss that she had with another girl, and everything goes to hell. Her family falls apart, and to make things worse, Libertad realizes that her older brother might be risking his life to take part in some very dangerous protests. This is such an amazing book. It is hard to read at times, and it does take an unflinching look at the political dangers and realities specific to this time period, but it's also about finding your people and realizing that holding each other to a higher standard and expecting more for and from the people we care about most is a tremendous act of love. And if I do say so myself, I think this could very easily apply to the no hype prompt. The next category is nonfiction, and there is no way I could talk about this prompt without bringing up The Other Olympians by Michael Waters. This is a queer history book. It explores the history of early trans and intersex athletes, especially those who competed on the global stage, and also the Olympic bureaucrats who interpreted their genders and their bodies as a threat and as a basis for developing early models of gender surveillance. This is truly such an invaluable book that has so much to offer. It painstakingly extracts these previously erased threads of history, showing how these athletes were on a collision course with Nazi Germany in the 1936 Olympics, and how those fascist views and policies very much played a role in igniting the culture wars that we still see raging today. This is not only informative, fascinating, and accessible, but it's also a celebration of how trans people have always existed and have always found ways to affirm and live in our transness. On a completely different note, I would also recommend Making Love with the Land by Joshua Whitehead. This is part autobiography, part autofiction, part biotext, part prose poetry, and part academic treatise. It's an almost alchemical collection of essays in which Joshua Whitehead explores the relationships between body, land, and language. This is one of the most special collections of essays I've ever read. It really challenges the reader to rethink the very concept of land, positing body as land, community as land, and the self as land. And if all of those things are land, how does that help us to better understand our roles as stewards of that land? It's honestly a book that defies description, but I just need you to know that it is top tier, and I absolutely wholeheartedly recommend it. Next is Disaster Queers, which honestly has so many options, but I could not resist going down the obvious route and once again recommending The Disasters by M.K. England. This is a delightfully chaotic and riotous YA sci-fi adventure about a young hotshot pilot named Nax who's kicked out of the Ellis Station Academy in less than 24 hours. He's put on a one-way transport back to Earth, but that transport is cut short when the Academy is attacked. And now Nax and 3 other washouts who miraculously find a way to escape are the sole witnesses to the biggest crime in galactic history, and they also happen to be the perfect scapegoats. Listen, what you see in the title is exactly what you get. It's right there on the tin. This is a hilarious and chaotic sci-fi adventure where a bunch of disaster queers are trying their best to save the day while also being hunted at the same time. It's a really fun read, and if you haven't picked it up in the last 6 years, here's your chance. I also wanted to recommend a more recent release, which is Prince of the Palisades by Julian Winters. This is a super fluffy and adorable royal romance about Jaden, a prince who was recently exiled from his kingdom because of his bad behavior. And now he's in California, where he's meant to do some very carefully planned publicity and appearances, rehabilitate his image, and not make any waves at his new fancy private school. Jaden is determined to prove everyone wrong and turn everything around, but falling for a cute filmmaker at his new school was not part of those plans. I think this book fits this prompt because obviously with royalty and a high profile, shenanigans are bound to happen, and happen they do. Jaden is definitely a disaster queer, not because he's a bad person or has a bad heart, but because he's a young person trying to figure himself out in the spotlight. Moving right along to the high hype, no hype prompt. I am not going to recommend books with high hype because I don't think you need my help to find them, so I'm going to be focusing on books that I think do not have anywhere near the hype they deserve. Firstly, The Best Bad Things by Katrina Carrasco. That's right, I'm back on my fucking soapbox. I have been shouting about this book for the past few years, desperately trying to get more people to read it, so please put me out of my misery. It is fantastic, I promise. This is like a queer historical detective thriller set in 1887 and following a Mexican-American undercover operative named Alma who works for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. But she's actually dismissed for bad behavior because she she has a habit of disguising herself as a man, which people in 1887 do not like. After being left out in the cold by her agency, she now works on the West Coast in the smuggling ring, and she disguises herself as a scrappy dock worker named Jack Camp so she can track down a thief and recover some missing drugs. Honestly, just thinking about how incredible this book is causes me to go feral on a regular basis. It is criminally good, pun only slightly intended. It has mystery, it has action, it has suspense, and it is so aggressively bisexual and incredibly gender-fucky in ways that I can't even express. I am also going to take this chance to once again wholeheartedly recommend The World and All That It Holds by Alexander Hamon. This is an extraordinary piece of queer historical fiction. It begins at the literal dawn of World War I in 1914 when the main character, Pinto, actually witnesses the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. From that moment on, he is torn away from his small Bosnian village and drafted to fight in the war. To his surprise, he falls in love with a fellow soldier named Osman, and because neither of them want to be fighting in this war, they decide to escape together and find themselves on the run as refugees. This is another book that I have been on hands and knees begging people to read. I cannot even describe how sensational this story is. It is truly a masterpiece. Don't let the World War I piece scare you off. The story is largely about these characters' experiences as war refugees and the unforgettable journey they undertake in order to somehow find their way home and find their way towards a shared life. The next prompt is gifted, which is mostly for reading books that you were gifted in one way, shape, or form. But I think you could also interpret it as a queer book that has a gifted main character. Maybe they're magical, maybe they go to a magical school, maybe they're the chosen one because they have some unique ability, and so on and so forth. I think an easy choice to fulfill that would be the Sunbearer Trials, because all the semidioses in the story have special gifts, almost like superpowers that are passed on from their godly parents. I would also say that In Other Lands by Sarah Rees Brennan fits the bill because it's set at a magic school, and the delightfully insufferable main character, Elliot, is surrounded by incredibly gifted peers as he tries to discover his own gift. The next prompt is a very fun one. It is the past, present, future prompt. I think you could easily fit something that addresses one or more of these time frames. You could read historical fiction for past, you could read something contemporary or recently released for present, you could read an arc for future. I tried to challenge myself to find time travel books that would hit on all three timelines. The first is In Universes by Emmett North. This is about Rafi, who works in an observational cosmology lab searching for dark matter, and they also spend a lot of time obsessing over a queer sculptor named Britt. As their carefully constructed life begins to collapse in on itself, they become fixated on the multiverse and the possibility that there is a universe out there where Britt cares as much about them as much as they do about her. I have been wanting to read this one so badly. I've heard incredible things about it from so many reviewers. It's supposed to be a mind-bending tour across parallel worlds, across timelines, which is very much my thing. My other suggestion is a book that I recently discovered for myself, and that is One Day You'll Leave Me by Deborah Flores. This is about a woman named Karen who lives a perfectly ordinary life in 2010, until she hears a song that she's never heard before and finds herself moved in inexplicably extraordinary ways. The singer, Judy Page, is also an ordinary woman living an ordinary life until the day she sang that song at a concert in 1964. Karen's curiosity turns to obsession, leading her to a town in Texas where Judy was born and raised. And that's where Karen is approached by a man calling himself Mr. Smith, who asks her if she would like to meet Judy, despite the fact that Judy has been dead for 20 years. I don't know about you, but I am fascinated. I have so many questions, and if you also find yourself with questions about what this story could possibly entail, then you can pick it up and find out. Also, it should go without saying that if you have not yet heeded the word of Bigilus Dickolas and read the masterpiece that is This Is How You Lose the Time War, then now is a great chance for you to do that. Next up is Winter Holiday, and before I even say my suggestions, I will redirect you to some amazing Instagram lists from people I follow full of queer holiday stories and holiday romances. I will have those linked down below because they are tremendous resources. My first recommendation is a book I read recently for a book review project that you should hopefully see sometime soon, and that is Make the Season Bright by Ashley Herring Blake. This is about two musicians and ex-fiancés, Charlotte and Brighton, who have been living their separate lives ever since Brighton left Charlotte at the altar without any explanation. And by pure coincidence, 5 years later, they're both invited by friends to spend the Christmas holiday in Colorado, only to find out that they've been invited to stay in the same House. This is both a really fun and really messy holiday romance. One of the things I enjoyed most is that there's a big group of queer friends at the center of the story, and one of the ways that Brighton and Charlotte are dealing with forced proximity is the fact that they're all roped into a series of holiday activities for queer singles. It's full of holiday shenanigans and set against the backdrop of this cozy, perfectly Christmassy small town in Colorado. And this could definitely apply for the travel prompt since both characters travel out of state, and also the community prompt because of the found family elements as well. My second recommendation is a little more underrated. It's a novella called The Mistletoe Motive by Chloe Leese. This is about a demisexual and autistic bookseller named Gabby who absolutely loves the holidays, but she also has to deal with her super analytic co-manager and arch nemesis Jonathan, who absolutely despises the holidays. They work at the same indie bookstore, which is facing financial hardship, and because neither of them wants to lose their job, they strike a deal that whoever sells the most books in the month of December gets to fully take over as manager of the store. This is just a really sweet romance. The characters have great chemistry, and even though they start off as having what I call professional animosity towards each other in the beginning, they end up having a really wonderful connection. It's just a short, cheerful, romantic, fun read, and it could also count for disability, not only because Gabby is autistic, but because Jonathan has type 1 diabetes as well. Penultimately, we have the Ghosts prompt, and the first book I want to recommend is a middle grade book called Too Bright to See by Kyle Lukoff. This is a contemporary ghost story about an 11-year-old trans kid named Bug who is getting ready to go into middle school, and his best friend decides that they have to use the summer to prepare themselves, finding the right clothes, learning how to put on makeup, figuring out which boys they're crushing on, etc. But Bug wants nothing to do with any of those things, and he has much bigger things to worry about because there is a ghost haunting Bug's house. In fact, it might be haunting Bug himself. If you haven't read this one yet, it is absolutely brilliant. It's a creative and engaging way of exploring how trans folks are often quote-unquote haunted by our true selves, or haunted by a version of ourselves that we don't yet know how to name or grapple with. It's just a really wonderful and thoughtful story, and I definitely recommend it. My other suggestion is a book I haven't read yet, but I really want to, and that is Till the Last Beat of My Heart by Loangie Bo Montez. This is a YA contemporary fantasy/paranormal story about Jackson, who is the son of a local mortician, and usually when someone in town dies, their body is brought to his house, where his mom runs the business. Usually he does his best to ignore these bodies, but his world is turned upside down when the corpse of Christian Reyes is brought in after a car accident because he was Jackson's once best friend and first crush. Jackson ends up accidentally resurrecting Christian with some newfound necromantic powers, but he'll have to figure out what to do with Christian before his borrowed time runs out. Yes, this book does have very strong Cemetery Boys vibes, and that's one of the reasons why it's on my radar, but I've also just heard it's a really great blend of paranormal mystery and queer teenage romance. Speaking of which, I would be laughed off the internet if I didn't at least mention Cemetery Boys in relation to this prompt, so this is me doing that. It's low-hanging fruit, but I will happily take that fruit every single time. Although if you really want to split hairs, the undead entities in this story are spirits, not ghosts, except Julian does sort of defiantly refer to himself as a ghost, so I think it counts. And the last prompt on the bingo board is graphic. Now, arguably, you could choose like a violently or sexually graphic book for this if you really wanted to, and that's fair. I am choosing to interpret it as reading books with graphic or illustrated elements like graphic novels or comics. My first suggestion is I Shall Never Fall in Love by Harry Connor. This recently came out. I'm very excited about it. It is a queer historical graphic novel about George, who has not only recently inherited the failing family estate, but also has increasingly complicated feelings about their best friend, Eleanor. As if that wasn't enough, if anyone ever found out they were secretly dressing in men's clothes, George would surely forever tarnish his family's name and reputation. Like I said, I've been very excited for this one. I might try to read it myself this round, we'll see what happens. I love a queer historical fiction story, especially those that revolve around gender expansive or gender defiant characters, which it seems like this one definitely does. Another queer graphic novel that I recently mentioned in my short Halloween books video is A Guest in the House by E.M. Carroll. This is a queer adult horror story about a woman named Abby who's recently married a widowed dentist, and as she's trying to settle into her new role as a wife and a stepmother, she begins to learn about her husband's first wife and starts to wonder whether she actually died of natural causes. The further she spirals into confusion, the more the first wife's memory seems to become a force all its own, ensnaring Abby in a mystery that leaves her obsessed, fascinated, and possibly in love for the first time in her life. I said it before, but I'll say it again. Falling in love with the ghost of your husband's dead wife is peak queerness that I can really get behind. So those are reading recommendations all across the bingo board for round 14 of the Queer Lit Readathon. If you plan to take part, I would love to hear what you plan to read, or if you have even more suggestions for any of these prompts, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!